the glory before darkness. He was no longer merely a man. He had become destiny itself, but destiny chose the wrong war. A time defined by one name, Napoleon. At the dawn of the 19th century, Europe was no longer a scattered map of kingdoms ruled by old men in stone castles. On that map, there shone a blinding light, not from the sun, but from the radiance of a man. They called him the Emperor of the world, the Eagle of Europe, the master of human fate. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the modest island of Corsica. Yet within 2 decades, he rose to become the very symbol of power, of victory, and of political transformation. Napoleon was not merely a general, he was a dreamer, one who longed to shape history with his own hands. He did what few could even imagine. He seized the destiny of an entire continent and commanded it when Europe bowed. From 1800 to 1809, he crushed one coalition after another. Austria, Prussia, Italy, Spain, Holland, all bowed before the thunder of the army the world came to fear and revere. La Grande Armée, the Great Army. It was not just mighty in numbers, it was mighty in spirit. These soldiers didn't fight for gold or land. They fought because they believed in something larger, that alongside Napoleon, they were creating a new world order. To them, he was not just a man, he was destiny, a god on horseback. And only one nation remained standing, unbent, Russia. The first cracks appear. Though Napoleon and Tsar Alexander, a man of Russia, had once signed the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, promising alliance, the treaty was no more than a sheet of ice, thin, fragile. Russia never truly trusted France, and Napoleon, he had never truly trusted anyone, except himself. When Alexander I refused to follow Napoleon's continental system, his plan to strangle Britons economically, the alliance cracked. Tension turned into silence, silence into dread, and soon everyone waited for the first cannon to fire. The fateful decision. Napoleon looked at the map. He did not merely want to defeat Russia. He wanted to conquer its heart. He believed that if he could take Moscow, just as he had taken Vienna and Berlin, the war would end. Alexander would fall to his knees. So he gathered an army of 600,000 men from over 20 nations. French, Italians, Germans, Poles, Dutch, Spaniards. It was the largest force Europe had ever seen. In June 1812, Napoleon crossed the river Niemen. No declaration of war, no ceremony, only a quiet whisper. I am marching toward eternity. The first steps into darkness. At first, everything unfolded as expected. The Russians retreated. No major battles. Napoleon advanced deeper into Russian soil, dozens of kilometers each day. He believed the decisive battle was close. Moscow awaited. And then, peace. But something wasn't right. Russia had invoked the scorched-earth strategy, burning villages, destroying supplies, evacuating civilians. What Napoleon found were not cities to conquer, but ashes, barren fields, and roads abandoned by men. The map said, there is a village here, but in reality, there was only smoke and ruin, the fatigue. No one anticipated that summer was unlike any before it. The Russian climate was cruel. The roads were a quagmire. Insects attacked endlessly. Water was contaminated. Thousands died, not in battle, but from dysentery, typhoid, and starvation. The greatest army in Europe began to tire. Napoleon fell into longer silences. Staff meetings grew tense. And yet, he pressed forward. He believed, with all certainty, that once he reached Moscow, everything would fall into place again, between glory and illusion. In September 1812, after the bloodbath at Borodino, where over 70,000 perished in a single day, Napoleon finally reached Moscow. But instead of trumpets and white flags, what did he find? Moscow, empty. Moscow, aflame. Moscow, like a soul choosing to die, rather than be enslaved. The fires burned for days. There was no letter of surrender, no Tsar, no emissary of peace. Napoleon stood at the gates of the Kremlin, the flames glowing in his sunken eyes. What he had wanted, a glorious victory, had become a hollow silence no one could fill. They set their own capital ablaze. What do they have left to lose? The moment of doubt. From the moment he entered Russia, Napoleon had ceased to be the Napoleon of Austerlitz or Marengo. Not because he fought poorly, but because, for the first time, he had lost control over fate. He could command horses, cannons, men, but he could not command nature. He could not force Alexander to kneel. He could not snuff out the flames. He could not delay the coming of winter. War, which had once been his symphony, had become a dirge, a mournful hymn he no longer conducted, the whisper of destiny. On the 10th night in Moscow, in a quiet room near the Kremlin, Napoleon sat alone. No advisors, no maps, only the early winter wind slipping through the wooden shutters. He closed his eyes. In his mind, there were no military plans, only one question. If I am no longer a god, then what am I? For the first time, he doubted himself. And in that moment, small and silent, destiny changed its course. Napoleon had reached Moscow, but he had not won. He had reached the heart of Russia, but lost the heart of himself. Into the unbroken land. He had entered Moscow, but Russia was not a city. It was the cold. It was the silence. It was a will that would not break. The city of fire and the silence that followed. Napoleon had arrived. Moscow, the jewel of the East, the pride of Russia. But what stood before him was no longer a city. It was a death ground, freshly scorched. The civilians had fled. The Russian army had withdrawn. And then, mysterious explosions rang through the air. Moscow went up in flames. No one came to extinguish the fire. The streets blazed like hell itself. Palaces, churches, libraries, all consumed by fire. The Russians had burned their own capital, rather than let Napoleon take it. He stood in the central square. For the first time in his life, he had won, without anyone losing. They didn't fight to protect the city. They fought to protect their spirit. I have captured the body, but not the soul of Russia, waiting in vain. Napoleon didn't retreat immediately. He waited for Alexander I to send a letter of surrender, waited for envoys to come, waited for a sign that victory had been acknowledged, but nothing came. Day after day, his reports read the same. No one has arrived. No word from Petersburg. We cannot stay here much longer. The army began to run out of food. The cold came earlier than expected. The fires of Moscow had not only burned the city, they had incinerated all hope of resupply. Bread wagons became hearses. France's finest soldiers collapsed, one by one, not by blade, but by cold, hunger, and despair, the blow of winter. By late October 1812, Napoleon made the decision. Retreat. Moscow held nothing left. Russia offered nothing more. But as the army left the city, under an early snowfall, they had no idea the real hell was just beginning. At first, it snowed gently, like a whisper. Then the temperature plummeted. 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees. The cold slashed through skin like knives. The proud faces of warriors became grey. Trembling, cracked lips frozen stiff. No army had ever fought this kind of winter. No European force had ever walked through a Russian winter and come out whole. We weren't fighting the Russians anymore. We were fighting nature itself. And nature shows no mercy. The retreat turns into a slaughter. Napoleon tried to maintain structure, breaking the army into divisions, issuing orders to preserve discipline. But those were words on paper. In reality, La Grande Armée began to shatter, like chunks of ice breaking on a frozen river. Food was gone. Bread wagons were ambushed. Men ate leather boots, then horse meat, then human flesh. Frost hardened even the kindest hearts. Those who fell behind were left. No one could carry the dying. The once mighty cavalry now trudged like phantoms. Each day of retreat became a march toward death, an enemy without swords. In this campaign, the deadliest killer of French soldiers wasn't Russian steel. It was hunger, cold, disorientation, and the slow suffocation of despair. Then, the Russian army returned, not to fight, but to hunt. Like wolves chasing a wounded animal, they struck the rear, cut supply lines, ambushed scattered columns. But they didn't need to win, because winter was doing the killing for them. "We don't need firepower," said General Kutuzov. "Death already walks with them every night." The Berezina River, where history bled. In late November, the French reached the Berezina River, partially frozen, waters rising fast. To cross it, they had to do the unthinkable. Build bridges under cannon fire and ice. 2 bridges were constructed from logs, ropes, and even human bodies. Tens of thousands pressed forward. Behind them, the Russians. Before them, the freezing waters. Some fell into the river, dead within minutes. Others were trampled to death. In the chaos, Napoleon crossed safely. But more than 30,000 never made it to the other side. Even General Sweep. At a way station near Vilnius, under a blizzard night, Marshal Michel Ney, known as the last soldier of the Grande Armée, stood alone, surrounded by corpses. He looked up at the sky, and he wept, not from defeat, but from meaninglessness, from the knowledge that tens of thousands had died, and there would be no victory to carry their names into memory. "I once fought to bring glory to France. Now I fight only to survive." When Napoleon was simply a man, on December 5th, 1812, the fearless emperor slipped away quietly, riding ahead of his dying army, bound for Paris. No fanfare, no farewell, no guards, no trumpets, just a lone figure, thin, bearded, eyes hollow, riding through the frost toward the memory of his own past. Behind him, an army dying, mile by mile, alive, but no longer a god. By early 1813, the once mighty Grande Armée of 600,000 had become a mere 50,000, and half of them could no longer hold a sword. Napoleon returned to Paris. He was not dethroned. The French still feared him, but they no longer believed in him. They looked at him, not as a conqueror, but as a legend that had fallen. An angel once brilliant, now alive, but stripped of its glow. Napoleon had retreated from Russia, not because he was defeated, but because he could not conquer nature or himself. The 12th campaign had not just destroyed an army, it had shattered immortality. The deadly winter, it wasn't the Russian army that destroyed the Grande Armée, not the sword, not the bullet. It was winter and pride, step by step, body by body. Night after freezing night, behind Napoleon was a shattered shadow. On December 5th, 1812, Napoleon silently left the battlefield, abandoning his dying army behind. He needed to return to Paris. He needed to protect the throne. He needed to rebuild his empire. But the army, they could not return. No warning, no preparation. In a single night, the greatest army in French history became a wandering mass of snowbound ghosts. No formations, no drums, no calls of Vive l'Empereur. Only dry, cracking breaths, trembling footsteps, and hollow, frozen eyes. Death needed no sword. As they retreated, the French did not march on roads. They marched on open graves. The land had been scorched weeks earlier. No food, no shelter, no fire. The wind sliced through the forests of white. Behind every snow-laden bush, a body curled and still. The temperature fell to 35 degrees Celsius. Soldiers who slept in the snow never woke again. The living dragged their dead to use their bodies for warmth. Horses died, their meat cut on snow, shared in silence. There were no more battles, only death, hour by hour, minute by minute. Quiet, slow, like a funeral march with no music. We weren't marching anymore. We were drifting through a white hell, a place with no devils, only emptiness, ghosts in the snow. At first, discipline held, but when ice cracked, even the strongest blades, morality shattered too. Men killed their comrades for boots that weren't torn. Some threw away their rifles, stripped off their coats, and wandered bare into the frost, mad with cold. Others sat in the snow, smiling, and froze to death in peaceful delusion. This was no longer war. It was a sacrifice of epic scale, where humans had to strip away their dignity just to breathe. Another hour, I watched him die and didn't cry, just felt grateful, because now I had a new coat, beasts in human form. As death became routine, hearts changed. A soldier who once wrote poetry now gnawed on a human bone to live. An officer who kept a nightly journal stopped writing. His fingers had frozen off, one knuckle at a time. In this campaign, evil did not come from hatred. It came from survival. Life had turned them into creatures, still shaped like men, but driven only by instinct. I didn't die, but I'm no longer myself. Numbers that no longer count. At the campaign's start, Napoleon commanded 600,000 men. Over 150,000 died of disease or starvation before winter even came. More than 100,000 were killed or captured in ambushes and battles. Another 200,000 disappeared, vanished into snow, into silence, into the wind. In the end, only about 20,000 soldiers made it back to the French border, and even fewer could still hold a sword. This was not defeat. This was dissolution, not the fall of an army, but the collapse of a dream, trampled beneath hoofs and buried in frost. The patient darkness of Russia. The Russian army did not chase like hungry wolves. They waited. General Kutuzov, old, slow, but wise, knew he didn't need to slaughter the Grand Army with steel. He only had to wait. We keep the fire, we hold the land, and they will extinguish themselves. It was the first time Napoleon was defeated, not by strategy, but by the endurance of a people who understood their land, their winter, and the price of freedom. The final crossing, the river Niemen. On December 14th, 1812, the last of the surviving French troops crossed back over the river Niemen, leaving Russia behind. They didn't cheer, they didn't sing. Behind them, a Europe littered with corpses, a winter filled with bones, a dream shattered into ice. Ahead of them, a France that no longer felt like home, and a returning emperor whose light had gone out. No one will ever know how many tears froze solid during that march. Napoleon, the silence. After the roar, Napoleon returned to Paris, his body intact, but his soul fractured. There was no parade, no speech, no memoir about the Russian campaign. For years, one day a general asked him, why didn't Moscow surrender? Napoleon only whispered, because I didn't understand Russia. And now, they've made the world understand them. Survival of history and the haunting of defeat. The 1812 campaign became the most tragic symbol in modern military history. Not because of its size, but because of what it meant. It shattered Napoleon's myth of invincibility. It awakened Europe to the truth. Even the god of war could fall. Even the legend could bleed. And it left one image, forever, etched in the memory of mankind. An army buried in snow. Eyes blank, stepping one last time through the abyss. Napoleon did not lose because he was weak. He lost because, for the first time, he believed he was a god. And fate reminded him he was only human. From god to man, defeat did not kill him. It merely turned him back into a man. Return, but not truly home. December 1812. Paris was still cold, but not as cold as the eyes of the French people. As they saw Napoleon return, there were no fanfares, no arches of triumph, no crown lifted beneath the blare of trumpets. Napoleon returned in silence. His boots were caked in snow, his coat wrinkled, his beard unshaved. He looked more like a defeated soldier than an emperor, yet his eyes still burned, like embers that refused to die. He sat for hours, writing false reports. The campaign has achieved its initial goals. The army is being reorganized, but outside, whispers began. Whispers of a word banned for over a decade. Defeat, Europe rises, and no longer fears him. Just months after the Russian disaster, those who had once bowed before him now stood tall. Austria, Prussia, Sweden, Britain, Spain, one by one, they declared, Napoleon has lost his magic. They no longer believed he was invincible. They saw him now as a man, one who could freeze like anyone else, one who could retreat, one who could be alone in the snow. In 1813, the Sixth Coalition was born. Over 700,000 troops marched toward France. He once cast fear across the continent. Now that same continent is turning back, carrying vengeance. Leipzig, where myth collapsed. October 1838. Napoleon marched to Leipzig to confront the coalition. It became the largest battle Europe had ever seen. 3 days of blood, cannons thundered, guns never cooled. But Napoleon was no longer the man from Austerlitz. His army was exhausted. His allies had betrayed him. Ammunition ran low. And his will was no longer unshakable. On the 3rd day, the retreat bridges were destroyed. Tens of thousands were left behind, and Napoleon retreated once more. For the 2nd time, he watched an army bearing his name collapse before his eyes. Paris falls. The emperor abdicates spring 1814. Coalition forces reached the gates of Paris. The people did not fight. They were too tired, too poor, too broken. On April 6th, 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. He tried to die. He drank poison, but the dose was old, and he survived. Then came an image no one ever thought possible. Napoleon Bonaparte, conqueror of Europe, exiled to the island of Elba, a tiny island. No army, no throne, only memories. The man in the mirror. On Elba, he rose early every morning. There were no drums, no rituals, only the sound of sea winds and his footsteps echoing in empty halls. One day he looked in the mirror and smiled faintly. Who are you? A failure, a forgotten man, or someone who once changed history? He began to write, to teach, to plant trees. People called it recovery, but for him, it was preparation, the return. 100 days of glory. March 1815. Napoleon escaped from Elba. When he stepped onto French soil, a detachment was sent to arrest him. But instead of hiding, he stepped forward, arms wide. If you want to shoot your emperor, shoot me here. And now, no one fired. One by one, they knelt. The news spread like lightning. Within 3 weeks, he reached Paris. Without firing a single bullet, crowds cheered, "Vive l'Empereur!" Napoleon had returned, but he knew, this time, the world would show no mercy. Waterloo, the final bell. June 18th, 1815. Waterloo, Belgium. Napoleon faced the British and Prussian forces. He fought with everything he had left: faith, memory, the soul of a crumbling empire. Rain soaked the battlefield. Cannons misfired in the mud. Orders were delayed. Reinforcements arrived late. By nightfall, the Imperial Guard was broken. Napoleon retreated, in rain, in blood, and in silence. No miracle, no sacred horse, no history to rescue him this time. The second and final exile Napoleon was captured. This time, there was no gentle Elba. He was sent to St. Helena, a wind-battered rock in the middle of the Atlantic. No escape, no letters, no dreams. There, he lived for 6 years. Each day the same, each night endless. He wrote, he told stories. He stared toward the horizon, where once Europe had trembled beneath his boots. Now, only distant mist remained. Death in solitude and immortality in memory. On May 5th, 1821, Napoleon took his final breath. There was no national funeral, no trumpet send-off, no heir by his side, but he did not die a loser. He died as a man who had dared to challenge destiny and paid the price. His gravestone bore no title, no emperor, no conqueror. It simply read, Napoleon. He lived as a legend, but he died as a man, and that made him immortal.